back to History Class with Dr. W. We are continuing and in fact in this lecture concluding our discussion of the Federalist Papers and the so-called Great Debate over the ratification of the Constitution. In this lecture we're going to talk about the idea of separation of powers, and we'll conclude the debate and talk about the ratification of the Constitution itself. As we talk about the debate between the separation of powers, let me just reiterate some of the ideas we talked about in the previous lecture about the legislative branch. Recall that the Anti-Federalist argument was that the House of Representatives, which was elected directly by the people, should be sufficient in the legislative arena. They also argued that those officials should be elected annually and that the House should be expanded to include more representatives and fewer constituents voting for each one of those representatives. Now, from the Federalist perspective, the House was the body that needed to be checked. Remember, the closer you get to this kind of mass mentality or mob mentality, the more they needed to be checked. So elections every few years, every 2 years for representatives was sufficient, and more representatives might lead to that kind of mob mentality. So it was the House that needed to be checked, and the Senate was really the kind of preferable body. So now let's extend that discussion to a discussion of the idea of separation of powers more broadly. And we're going to talk about the executive and judiciary branches in just a moment. The Anti-Federalists worried that their kind of favored house, the House of Representatives, would be overshadowed by the Senate and the other branches. For Madison and the Federalists, it was the House that needed to be checked. And part of the Anti-Federalist concern was that there was too much overlap between and among the various branches, and thus the House could sort of be rendered, if not powerless, then less powerful than the others. Recall that the president or executive has the ultimate veto power over the legislative branch. The Senate has oversight over the president and the executive branch with treaties and appointments and things like that. And the judiciary, as we will see, has the right and the power to kind of determine and judge which of these actions are actually legal. So the Anti-Federalists kind of see that the House is the least kind of powerful in this cluster of overlapping areas. Madison makes the argument, though, that unless these departments be so far connected and blended as to give each other a constitutional control over the others, then checks and balances don't really work. There has to be enough overlap amongst the branches for the checks and balances to really be effective. So this really is a unique and novel approach to government and a new idea that we are safeguarding the rights and representations of the people and the nation by dividing up the powers of the government and giving each branch powers to check and balance the others. And this may be the real kind of beautiful element of our government that has allowed it to last for so long. Checks and balances ultimately do prove effective. In Madison's view, it was the Senate that may have been the most important of all of the various bodies in the government. The Senate, which included some elements of democratic rule and some elements of aristocratic rule, also had its hand in a number of different aspects of governance itself. Therefore, Madison saw you have this body which would always remain small in number, 2 from each state, and which would provide a counterbalance to the House of Representatives, which could be more fluctuating in its tendencies, elected only every other year, and so on. The Senate thus would also include more distinguished and experienced men, while the House might include some of those from what we described in a previous lecture as the middling sort. Senators represent their entire state and thus have a broader view of issues, and senators serve 6-year terms and can be reelected perpetually for life if that is how it works out. So, in the Anti-Federalist view, they were concerned that the states would not have enough power to check the federal government. And as it turned out, I don't think they were viewing thoroughly enough the beauty of this internal system of checks and balances among the various branches of the government. The Anti-Federalists were suspicious of Madison's Senate, where Madison saw these kind of well-educated and elder statesmen. Anti-Federalists saw, quote, a monster of baneful aristocracy which will swallow up the democratic rights and liberties of the nation. As we move now to think about the presidency, the Anti-Federalists also were concerned about the power of the proposed presidency, which they thought looked too much like the kind of monarch that they had just worked in the Revolutionary War to overthrow. They actually proposed a small executive council rather than one person with so much power. Alexander Hamilton, in Federalist Papers 69 and 70, defended the presidency, which after all was in good part of his design. The presidency really wasn't like a monarch. The powers of the presidency were much more limited than a monarch, and they were checked by the other branches. And as Hamilton argued, it was better to have power seated in one good president than in several sort of mediocre executives. You were likely to have much more infighting and division if power was divided amongst several people in this one role. There are many decisions that need to be made where you simply need one person in charge with the full power to make that decision. As a final thought, Hamilton returned to an argument that the Federalists employed in many different instances, and that is the idea that this was a new kind of role and a new sort of position which frightened Anti-Federalists somewhat. That was a strength, because what do we know about all previous republics? They all failed. So we don't want to replicate what previous republics have done. We want to take the better elements of it and build something even better. The final branch of the government is, of course, the judiciary. And as with the other branches, the Anti-Federalists had concerns and reservations about the judiciary as proposed by the Constitutional Convention. The federal judiciary, they worried, would weaken other local and state authorities. They also worried that the Supreme Court was not democratic. Justices are appointed and thus may stray into the realm of this aristocratic rule. As in the other areas, there was debate and back and forth between Federalists and Anti-Federalists about the judiciary. In Federalist Paper 78, Hamilton wrote about the judiciary, and he said the judicial branch will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution because it will be least in capacity to annoy or injure them. The judiciary, he argued, had no power over the purse or the sword, that is, the budget or the military, and justices on the court will be uniquely qualified and knowledgeable. And here again we come back to the idea of civic virtue. We're assuming to some degree that those who are in power will be making decisions that are in the best interest of the people. They will not be acting merely in their own selfish interests or working against the better good of the country. So we're going to make a good faith effort to select qualified and knowledgeable justices, and we'll make a good faith effort to review and vet those candidates and appoint them. And so you shouldn't have the kind of problems and concerns that Anti-Federalists were worried about. So if there is an aristocratic element to the judiciary, it actually works to the favor of the functioning of the government. Having had all of these various debates playing out within the Federalist Papers and being debated across the various states, finally the Constitution was ratified. New Hampshire was the 9th state to ratify in June of 1788, thus ensuring that the Constitution would, in fact, go into effect. And the final states, which included Virginia and New York, were ratified conditionally. That is, when I first started talking about the Federalist Papers and this debate, they were ratified on the condition that the founders would consider a Bill of Rights, and it is to that that we will turn in the next lecture.